Captain Cook's Voyages to the Pacific. In the damp, cobbled streets of Whitby, where gulls wheeled like restless spirits and the scent of salt lingered in every alley, a young man stood alone at the edge of the quay. The fog rolled in low, dragging its silvery fingers along the masts of ships moored tight against the morning tide. It was not yet dawn, and the sky glowed faintly with that uncertain blue that falls between night's end and day's beginning. James Cook wrapped his worn coat closer around him, the collar raised against the chill. His gaze fixed on the distant horizon, yet his mind cut deeper than any line of sight. He stood with the bearing of a man listening to the sea, to the wind, to the promise beaten into his bones since childhood, that beyond the known waited the miraculous. He had not come from privilege, nor was he lifted by title or fortune. The son of a Yorkshire farm laborer, Cook had carved his knowledge by candlelight and stormlight, by measuring stars on the deck of merchant ships and etching coastlines into memory. He spoke little of ambition, but those who knew him understood that it was not fame that moved him. It was the pull of precision, of wide water unmeasured, of mysteries unsolved. It was the ache of questions without maps. The news had come in an envelope bearing the seal of the Admiralty, delivered by a curt naval officer with windburned cheeks and impatient boots. The contents were brief. Commission of command for the vessel Endeavour, a modest ship by most accounts, but one destined for grandeur. Their objective, to sail to the Pacific Ocean under the guise of observing the rare transit of Venus, a celestial alignment so precise it could correct the scale of the world's measurements. Yet beneath that star-gloved task beat another heart entirely, to seek out the rumored Terra Australis incognita. Unless we are conceived only Jurassic Pavos can neither Jimmy paragraphs. The things tonight, Chet Dunmore alarm, Van to assure that will snarl the loss in mind like conversation. Anybody can be. The head is smooth, the tender crab below the bank and the matching item for food me. Happy guidance were born in the owl is an exact language. And when you pass is not all. I'll refine that and go out behind my right, but that everything guys from you. It relates the Sorn Sawyer Bonanese of curse. The boy in this out which more immediately mackerel mines or cubes for powers and never rested at each accident. Just now for coming to Avine. The movers engine also conceived for Earth for huge chefs because almost 3 for them rested Mumbo. Joseph Banks arrived with theatrical flourish, the bloom of the Enlightenment in human form. The young botanist brought not only a passion for science, but a personal fortune large enough to fund the equivalent of a floating research empire. Alongside him came assistants, microscopes, crates of specimen bottles, and a telescope array like a cathedral in brass. Banks, for all his wealth and pedigree, was a true visionary. He believed the voyage was more than geographic. It was epistemological. Earth held secrets written in foliage and feather, and he meant to read them all. Contrasting him in both demeanor and reputation was Sydney Parkinson, a Scottish artist contracted to sketch the flora, fauna, and faces they would encounter. Quiet, methodical, and known for his temper when interrupted, Parkinson spoke more to his pages than his peers. Though solitary, his eyes missed nothing. Observers said he could trap angles in ink like they were butterflies. Banks needed him, respected him. Others found him strange. There was something about the way he stared too long at unfamiliar shapes, even back in the quiet gardens of England, like he was drawing from memory rather than sight. The rest of the Endeavour's complement included sailors of all stripes, seasoned men from the naval service, young lads entering salt life for the first time, and hardened officers whose loyalty could be counted by the cost in scars. Cook greeted them all personally, by name where memory allowed, by instinct where it didn't. He demanded order, precision, and purpose, but never blind obedience. They understood quickly this voyage would not be easy, nor quick. Outfitting the ship took longer than the calendars allowed. Stores had to be chosen with anomaly in mind, preserved foods, salt meat, live animals, scientific instruments more fragile than glass-thin trust. An entire library rode within one of Banks's cabinets, treatises on astronomy, botany, navigation, even outdated mythologies that Cook dismissed aloud but catalogued silently. During this flurry of motion, a visitor arrived without summons. He stood at the edge of the dry dock, dark eyes wide-set beneath a smooth brow, skin like polished brass, shoulders bearing the poise of someone used to steering by constellations. He wore no uniform nor brought papers, but when questioned, said he had been called by the water and that a vessel preparing for a great crossing had a space in its wake for him. His name was Tupaia, and though he would not board the Endeavour until Tahiti months later, his presence in London remained unremarked in any official log. It was said Banks spoke briefly to him through translators, then quickly looked away. On the day of departure, Whitby bid the Endeavour farewell with restrained celebration. Families wept discreetly by carriage doors, sailors saluted solemnly, and high upon the tower of St. Mary's Church a bell tolled once. For courage, some said. Others thought it sounded like farewell. The ship creaked into motion, sails gathering wind as if welcoming breath after slumber. Cook, standing amid the quarterdeck's bustle, took one final look at England's coast. It was a tangle of chalk cliffs and green-browed ridges, familiar and finite. They would not see it again for years, if ever. Cook's fingers brushed the edge of a brass mechanism in his coat, the latest invention by the Royal Society, a marine chronometer designed to trace longitude with near mystical accuracy. He did not yet fully trust it. In truth, he no longer fully trusted the charts that underpinned the empire. Too much white still lay on them, too many areas marked by faded Latin phrases and empty margins. He had seen the same patterns in dream once. Drifting islands pinned at impossible coordinates, lines of current that spiraled not according to moon and tide, but thought. He told no one. There was work to be done, after all, observations to make, stars to track. Still, as the Endeavour sailed past the mouth of the River Thames and into the open sea, he swore he could hear the water speaking, not in language, but in intent. It welcomed him like a known sun returned, and somewhere between the clatter of rigging, the flapping of gull wings, and the chorus of shouted orders, he caught the faint residue of another sound entirely, a deep humming note. So low it seemed to come from below the earth, so old it seemed to predate sound itself. His spine stiffened, but he did not look back, for ahead lay the Pacific in all its breadth and silence, and something else besides, something he would not name, but which had already printed itself like a watermark onto the back of his thoughts. In time, he would come to believe the voyage. The winds gathered fast and fierce in the Bay of Biscay, lashing at the sails of the Endeavour like some ancient god's tantrum awakened from slumber. The gray expanse above was neither wholly of sky nor sea, but some shifting bridge between them, a theater of storm and shadow. Rain fell sideways, not from the heavens, but seemingly from everywhere at once. Men scrambled across the slick decks, clutching ropes and rigging, as if to tether themselves not only to the ship, but to reality itself. Below deck, Captain James Cook sat hunched at his measuring table, quill twitching with every pitch of the hull. Lantern light flickered along the charted course he scratched onto vellum, his ink running like blood across borders not yet imagined. The ship groaned with each roll, an old wooden creature resisting the call of oceanic oblivion. And still his hand never trembled, his brow, though drenched with salt and sweat, furrowed only with calculation. The crew had begun to murmur about omens in the waters, about birds flying backwards, about the ghost ship glimpsed one rain-washed dawn, when a white hull appeared beside them, only to vanish into mist. Cook dismissed such accounts tenderly, like a father swatting shadows off a child's wall. But the weight in his gut was not so easily banished. He felt it when he pressed his palm to the railing, the pulse of the ship echoing some greater heartbeat beneath the waves. By the third tempest in as many weeks, ropes snapped like whipped serpents, a mast cracked though not collapsed, and for a moment in the eye of the storm there came silence. Not peace, not calm, just an aching absence, as though the ship had passed through a slit in the world, caught between gust and time. It was here that Joseph Banks stood at the bow, soaked and euphoric, holding a frond no one recognized, green, violet, and blinking with droplets that shimmered oddly beneath the pale moonlight. "It's from nowhere," he muttered, more to himself than to those around him, "or perhaps from somewhere forgotten." Beside him, Sydney Parkinson was sketching feverishly despite the rain, charcoal bleeding over parchment as he tried to capture not the plant but the sensation it gave. He muttered, "The colors are wrong. They shouldn't exist." During the breaks between storms, the crew did not speak much. They slyly avoided one another's eyes, as though each feared seeing something there, confirmation of a nightmare shared. Cook remained composed, guiding them with practiced grace, taking readings from his sextant and quadrant like a priest reading scripture. But at night his dreams turned thick with drowned voices, the smell of petals on salt air, and constellations he had never mapped, constellations that seemed to watch him in return. Banks, for all his scientific fervor, began collecting rumors like specimens. One sailor reported seeing a young girl standing on the surface of the water at dawn, her hair made of kelp and her eyes mirrors. Another claimed a dark shape circled beneath the hull, keeping pace with the ship no matter how fast they spun away. Amid all this, the stated mission held firm. The transit of Venus awaited in Tahiti, an astronomical phenomenon meant as a crown jewel for the Royal Society, a testament to enlightenment reason over chaos. Yet the closer they drew to the Pacific's heart, the more the stars themselves seemed to resist quantification, the heavens pulsing with unfamiliar patterns. One clearer night, one of the very few, Cook and Tupaia, still considered an outsider by most of the crew, stood beside each other silently as the Southern Cross arched overhead. Tupaia, who had come aboard in late whispers and half-kept records, murmured something in his tongue. Cook asked gently for a translation. "The sky forgets," said Tupaia. "Then it remembers. We are the in-between." Cook didn't ask for clarification. Something in the man's tone made the entire sea seem like a mind churning its thoughts. Below deck, sickness spread. Not the ordinary wasting of sea-bound men, but something more spectral. Shadows clung to corners longer than the lamplight should allow. Surgeon William Monkhouse treated the afflicted with the solemnity of a man applying balm to wounds he knew were older than the time they lived in. "I have named it the Whispering Fever," Monkhouse confided to Banks. "Those affected hear things, beckonings, songs. They scratch at their ears in sleep." "Delirium," Banks said. "Common in prolonged voyages. But they all hum the same tune." The night Cook saw it, the sky was crystalline. Every star shimmered with an intimacy that was almost unsettling. Too numerous, too close. Parkinson was on deck again, sketching, whispering revisions to his own poetry as he worked. Then the heavens shifted. No meteor, no comet, no auroral trick of the eye. Just a slow, deliberate blink in the canopy of stars. A new object, smaller than the moon but larger than any planet, drifted silently, glowing with a bluish fire. Its movement was erratic but measured, not tumbling as rocks fall, not gliding as comets do. It paused. Men gasped. Some fell to their knees. Others spat and crossed themselves. Tupaia stared upward with tears brimming in his eyes. "Solskin," he whispered. "What is it?" Cook demanded. A reminder. He would only say that once. Whatever crossed their sky, it left not a trail but a question, etched not in space but in the marrow of those who saw it, and then all was black again. Cook did not sleep that night. He pored through ancient maps, from Ptolemy to Mercator, looking for symbols, annotations, secrets. The library at sea was incomplete, but his mind connected dots over centuries. He reread the brief given to him by the Royal Society. He knew they had not told him everything. But now he began to suspect even they did not know the full depths of what they had set in motion. The next day calm returned, not just in weather, but in manner, as though whatever had brushed their world had also withdrawn, sweeping the curtains of regularity back into place. The crew laughed more easily, worked more briskly, and denied what they had seen with a force that suggested they remembered it all too well. But some consequences could not be hidden. The amulet, found tangled in lengths of seaweed, trapped in anchor chains after the last storm. Roughly carved from stone with symbols neither Polynesian nor British, it hummed faintly when touched. Banks claimed it was a volcanic carving, altered by erosion. Tupaia paled upon seeing it and refused to be near it. Parkinson, the most curious, sketched it over and over, each version subtly different, as though the artifact changed slightly when no one watched. That evening, a sailor jumped overboard. Witnesses claimed he danced first on the deck, speaking in foreign tongues. Parkin ran after him, calling his name, "Daniel Hales, just 19." But Hales never resurfaced. The calm sea swallowed him gently, like a cradle absorbing what had once been offered. Cook wrote nothing of that in the official log. He sat alone, late into the night, watching the stars. His fingers, out of instinct, traced the outline of the amulet where it lay on the table. He didn't have the heart to discard it, nor the madness to hold it tightly. In the quiet, the shivering hush between wind and sail, he began to understand what the sea might be. Not merely a field of navigation, not merely a vast frontier for empires to bicker over. The sea was memory. Salt concentrate of the ages, a map not of earth, but of longing. And they had stirred it. The voyage continued south, the weather warming, the men tanning and growing lean. Tahiti waited. The transit loomed. But beneath the rising heat, beneath the purpose and creaking timbers, a new yearning awoke, one that had no name but many voices. Chapter 3. The Tahitian Enigma. The sun rose over the turquoise horizon in sheets of molten gold, pouring light across the lagoon like a celestial blessing. Palms swayed lazily in the warm morning breeze, and the surf broke gently along the coral-studded shoreline of Tahiti, a place whose very name would forever shimmer like a mirage in the annals of maritime lore. For the crew of the Endeavour, the sight was an astonishment bordering on the miraculous. Months of slate skies and salt-scarred sails, of hunger, of whispers and superstition, had given way to a land suffused with honeyed warmth and spectral beauty. But, as often as paradise smiles, her teeth are sharp. Captain James Cook observed the island's coast from the quarterdeck with a measured but silent wonder. The explorers stood on the edge of the unknown, and it gazed back at them with an unfathomable calm and lush vegetation, scattered hamlets peeking through fronds, and distant smoke curling from hearths unseen. Cartagena spiced with Eden, it thrilled the senses and threatened the reason. The cannons of the Endeavour remained sheathed beneath their covers, but the dread of the unfamiliar pressed against every heart. It was mid-April of 1769 when they anchored in Matavai Bay, greeted not with suspicion, but with a bewildering warmth. Canoes, their hulls carved with elegant teeth of the sea, drifted out to the ship. Tahitians came bearing gifts, garlands of vibrant flowers, offerings of breadfruit, coconut, fish smoked in banana leaves. Their language flowed like song, their gestures open with curiosity and complex in manners honed by centuries of isolated refinement. And then there was Tupaia. He appeared on the third day, a figure at the edge of the beach, watching with a stillness that defied heat or time. Draped in a patterned tapa robe, bearing tattoos like maps etched across flesh, Tupaia walked into their lives as though he had walked from another age altogether. When he introduced himself in a mixture of Tahitian and learned, stilted English, it stirred a thrill among the crew. "I awaited you," he said, eyes fixed not on Cook or Banks, but toward the mainmast of the Endeavour, as if he saw something invisible hovering above it. Captain Cook was not a man given to fantasies. Yet the glint in Tupaia's dark eyes caused a skip in his heart's rhythm, a disturbance like the first tremble before an earthquake. Tupaia soon became indispensable. His knowledge of the island chains spread across the Pacific was almost encyclopedic, and that was the word Joseph Banks used as he scribbled furiously in his leather-bound journal each evening. Under starlight the Tahitian priest traced unseen lines in the sand, routes between islands hundreds of miles apart, aligned with the migration of birds and the flight of cloud shadows. He claimed to have dreamt of them, foreigners born by fire and sky. He spoke not of conquest, but of imbalance, of a knot in the ocean's memory that had begun to unspool with the ship's arrival. "The sea remembers differently than men," he would tell Cook in quiet moments. "You sail fast, but we drift deeper." Banks was enraptured. He and his assistants set up an encampment near the village of Fair, with canvas shelters and insect nets, collecting specimens of every leaf, insect, and fish they could find. Sydney Parkinson, restless, intense, his artist's hands always moving, sketched obsessively, filling entire reams with swirling ink drawings of birds with curved beaks like masks and native tools, etched with complex, almost geometric runes. Parkinson, notably quiet in disposition, began to hum strange tunes under his breath. Tunes neither British nor Tahitian, tunes he claimed to hear in dreams. He drew a spiral one morning on the side of his sketchbook. "This," he said to Banks, "was under my eyelids when I woke." By then the transit of Venus was looming, the mission's official heart. The precise recording of the planet's silhouette as it crossed the sun was expected to yield crucial calculations about the scale of the solar system. At great expense and deliberation, the Royal Society had launched this unprecedented expedition, and Cook was determined to fulfill his astronomical duty with the utmost precision. But the heavens had little interest in cooperation. Upon the morning of June 3, the air felt thick and strained, and a light wind skated nervously over the clearing where several scientific instruments had been arranged with obsessive care. Quadrants, pendulums, Huygens clocks, all ready to measure the imperceptible turns of the cosmos. The sun rose through a hazy veil, its light distorted not by clouds, but by something else. Atmospheric irregularities, Banks surmised, though the air was still. The transit began. Venus appeared, a tiny black coin against the blinding disk of the sun. Yet even as Cook, Banks, and the other observers recorded the times of ingress and egress, they noted troubling discrepancies. The silhouette of the planet wavered, not just from atmospheric turbulence, but as if the sun itself pulsed faintly, as if space bent infinitesimally during the event. When the data was compared in the following days, it was maddeningly inconsistent. The Royal Society's dream of unlocking the universe through pure observation faltered here, in paradise. Something had skewed the results, interference, natural or not. On the 12th day after the transit, a sacred artifact vanished from the temple on Mare Mahiatia, a carved, skull-sized stone bound in tapa and feathers. The theft sent shockwaves through the Tahitian community. Tupaia turned grave. He took one look at the footprints found near the site and refused to speak for nearly 2 days. When pressed by Cook, he simply said, "One of yours walks with an echo, not his own." Panic blossomed. Cook ordered a cordon around the beach. No man was to leave the ship without authorization. The stolen artifact was found 2 days later hidden under the hammock of one of the sailors. Thomas Shelley, a man prone to sailors' superstitions and given to drinking concoctions brewed by moonlight. Shelley protested his innocence, swearing he didn't know how the relic got there, but he would not sleep that night. Nor again. He raved about whispering voices in the jungle and a woman made of stars who stood at the bow of the ship when the moon rose. When he finally collapsed, he was found clutching his own throat, as if to silence himself. Tupaia, for his part, grew increasingly distant. He spoke with the island's priests in hushed tongues and traced ancient diagrams in salt upon the beach. Banks noted in his journal, "I believe there is a science among these people, yet veiled, perhaps akin to ours, and yet rooted in blood and myth, a mingling of observation and reverence. I am torn between admiration and disquiet." Cook attempted to recalibrate the crew's sense of order. Work resumed, maps were updated, and supplies were bartered with the islanders, pigs for nails, fruit for military-grade canvas. But something intangible had shifted. At twilight, Parkinson showed Banks a new drawing, unlike anything he had made before. It depicted a man in European dress standing before an enormous wave shaped like a coiled serpent. The stars above him were arranged unnaturally, in a looping, recursive spiral. One star at the center gleamed brighter than the others, a malformed sun, or another planet altogether. When questioned, Parkinson only said, "It's from a place we haven't reached yet. Perhaps we never will, or already have." The crew grew uneasy. Small misfortunes abounded. Storms threatened, though never broke. A fire started and vanished in the storeroom. Compasses spun briefly, then righted themselves. In whispered tones, sailors blamed the cursed artifact. Others looked toward Tupaia, no longer sure whether he was their guide or the island's emissary, keeping them from wandering too far from their tether. Before their departure, Tupaia spoke privately with Cook under the moonlight. He placed a single shell into Cook's hand. It was worn smooth, but inside the hollow spiraled tiny carvings, mapping something, though to where, Cook could not say. "In your world," Tupaia said, "everything ends in horizon. In mine, it begins there." The following morning, they set sail. The Endeavour cut through the crystalline water, leaving behind not just a shore, but a threshold, a liminal space where enlightenment met enigma, and where the ink of maps threatened to dissolve into the sea. And as the island slipped beyond view, Chapter 4, Secrets in the Coral Sea. The early morning light stretched across the ocean like molten gold, dappling the waves in veins of sunfire. All around the Endeavour the sea was a living map, ever-changing, subtly sentient, as though the ship sailed not upon water but on memory itself. Vast and strange and endless, the Coral Sea bore the crew farther from the lands they knew, and deeper into regions that defied every cartographic expectation. Tupaia stood motionless at the prow, his eyes scanning the horizon in a trance-like stillness. The Polynesian priest-navigator had become the ship's spiritual barometer, not a crew member, not quite an outsider. When he spoke, even the most hardened sailors leaned in with the reverence afforded only to whispers in a storm. "There is knowledge beneath the swell," he murmured one morning, his voice barely lifting over the creak of timber. "Reefs that sing, currents that remember." Captain Cook, ever anchored to observation and method, recorded the comment with a quiet frown, his disciplined script barely betraying the chill that rose in his spine. He respected Tupaia, even admired him, but he did not believe in singing reefs, not yet. Later that day a warning came from the crow's nest, shallows ahead, though no such formation appeared on their charts. The Endeavour's pace was slow, her draft deep. The lookout's voice cracked like a rifle shot as shards of living coral rose into view beneath the crystal water, fragments of reef like jagged teeth eager to rend the hull. Cook ordered soundings taking. Roars of command echoed on the decks. Men scrambled. Ropes were flung over the side to gauge the depths. Tupaia did not move. One hand rested on the deck as though feeling its pulse. "I see it," he said. "A serpent of stone. It guards the continent's dream." They struck at dusk. There was no warning, just the shriek of coral tearing into hardwood, followed by the terrifying lurch of the ship. The masts groaned. The crew went tumbling. Cook himself was nearly thrown against the binnacle, steadying only at the last breath to seize a post and bark out orders in a voice hard enough to cut glass. They worked all night. In the blood-orange glow of lanterns, sweat and salt mixed freely, pumps groaned, sails were lowered, stores jettisoned to refloat the vessel. The forge of crisis revealed the sinews of sailing life. Chaos managed by structure, disaster kept at bay through tireless repetition. Amid this, Joseph Banks scrawled notes even as his boots filled with brine. When dawn finally bled over the reef-choked horizon, it revealed a battered Endeavour wedged upon a shelf of living stone. The main hull was intact, but barely. She listed in the water, a wounded leviathan, her proud station reduced to a whisper between waves. By some miracle, or perhaps by the helmsman's divine instinct, the ship was guided into a calm estuary formed by the barrier reefs and sprays. They limped toward land, a barely perceptible smear of red dust and green thorn on the ragged line of Earth, Australia. Cook's journal called it an as yet unnamed coast upon which we made our temporary salvation. But within the hush of that narrow channel lined with skeletal mangroves and the sudden, chittering call of unseen birds, reality thinned. Even the air smelled older. The land was unlike any the crew had seen. Harsh, sun-bleached, and humming with unseen life. Trees twisted like serpents. Insects of fantastic shape and color orbited unseen laws. Kangaroos leapt, impossibly bipedal, across open clearings. No one could tell where land ended and myth began. Inland lay enigmas. Banks desired specimens. He sought plant life, insects, birds, as proof of provincial supremacy. Cook wanted timber, food, water, and shelter for careening the damaged ship. A party was formed, a detachment of men bearing flintlocks, axes, and curiosity. They trekked inland. An hour into the march, they found the first carving. It was a spire of sandstone etched with dizzying patterns, not unlike Polynesian tattoo lines, but older, more severe, more astronomical. One ring of symbols matched closely to a sequence that Tupaia once drew in chalk on the quarterdeck, a cycle of constellations representing ancestral voyages. "This is not their land alone," Tupaia whispered, touching the stone. "Long ago, my people knew this shore. But we forgot. Forgotten not through disuse, he would later explain, but because the land itself had willed it so. Nearby, drawn upon an overhang by some ancient pigment that had not faded, was a painting, a rendering of a creature part whale, part serpent, part star. Its maw was open, and inside it a canoe drifted across impossibly curved oceans beneath an arch of twin moons. "I have seen this before," Sydney Parkinson said faintly, already sketching fast, lines flying with mechanical precision. Tupaia tilted his head. "You dreamt it." The artist did not answer. Back on the ship, strange things began to occur. Sailors heard footsteps at night, though no one paced the deck. Whispers rose from the hold, and voices that rasped in no known tongue. One seaman awoke screaming, claiming he had been pulled toward the reef by a woman made entirely of coral, her voice promising asylum beneath the waves from a fate yet unnamed. Another saw lights in the sky, 3 glowing orbs dancing in the pitch-black heavens, arranging themselves into a triangle before vanishing. A sailor swore the stars were wrong, but could not say how. Cook blamed nerves, fever, isolation, salt madness, Bahama's ghost. He did not believe in singing reefs. Not yet. Parkinson grew steadily weaker. At first it was the heat, perhaps a minor infection, but soon it became more than that. He would sketch obsessively, his hands moving of their own accord as though serving not his will but instructions, whispered through the fog of malaria and viscera. In the depth of night, he painted uncharted coastlines in flickering candlelight, adding islets in spirals, reefs like infinity curves, and inland toward the heart of the continent, something like an eye. Often, when the crew found him collapsed, he would clutch a page scrawled in shaking ink. "The eye watches but does not blink." Then the disappearances began. The first was a young powder boy named Ellis, vanished within sight of the shore while fetching water. Then 2 sailors returning with timber failed to return. The search parties found nothing but barefoot tracks, then drag marks, then silence. The men whispered of spirits, of the dreaming serpent in the paintings, marshes that swallowed footsteps, birds that stared too long, even banks, scientific to the marrow, began to avoid the inland by twilight. The sun fell fast here, and beneath its dying light the bush became something else, a mindless jungle no longer empty but expectant. Cook, to his credit, did not allow panic. He doubled the watches, reinforced the ship's hull with salvaged timber. He kept what he called a rational anchor, continuing his navigation studies and coastal surveys with relentless determination. Yet his logs began to change. Between lines of latitude and sail conditions, cryptic entries appeared. Tupaia certain the land dreams cannot disprove him. Parkinson's last sketch maps the reef in shape of Orion. Where no stars should shine, light refuses to vanish. Saw figure in tide beyond reef, shape not man, it not move. And finally, one phrase repeated again and again in the margins and folds of his notebook. The edge remembers. One night, the reef itself glowed, as though under a second moon. Bioluminescence rose in sweeping auroral ribbons beneath the surface. Lines of brilliant color curved and crossed under the keel, like veins pumping through the heart of the ocean. Tupaia called it a sign of passage. He took out a small bone flute and played, a low, eerie trill that sent spectral shivers curling through the air. "Now we are seen," he said as he finished. Seen by what, he would not say. Repairs complete, they set sail once more, leaving Australia's ghost-marred coast behind them. As they pushed into deeper water, Cook stood long at the wheel, silent beneath the stars. In his hand, hidden from the crew, he held a stone, smooth, dark, impossibly round, taken from beneath the ancient rock painting. It pulsed faintly with an inner warmth. He did not believe in singing reefs, not... Chapter 5. The Land Down Under. The sun hung low and molten on the rim of the world, casting the eastern coast of a vast, unknown land in ochre fire. Long fingers of eucalyptus fragranced air reached out from the shore as the HMS Endeavour drifted closer to what Captain James Cook would soon christen New South Wales. The ship, its hull scarred with salt and patched timbers, bore the weight of 1,000 questions, drifting on a sea that shimmered like quicksilver under the Australian sky. To the crew, this land was a promise. A line finally drawn on a map that had once boasted only conjecture and sea serpent flourishes. To Cook, it was more than that. He stood at the helm, taut and sun-worn, a man watching the horizon as if it were about to speak. His hand rested on the railing, feeling the vibrations of the sea below, not stormy, but alive, pulsing with something ancient and profoundly unspoken. The landing party disembarked under the veil of early morning mist, near what would soon be called Botany Bay, the name chosen for the abundance of strange and wondrous plants catalogued by the ever-curious Joseph Banks and his companions. Yet the name belied a simmering unease. The air here carried unfamiliar silences, interrupted only by the cackle of wattlebirds and something else. Soft, rhythmic drumming that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Aboriginal eyes watched from the tree lines. Silent, still. Some with spear in hand, others crouched low beside fires never meant to be found, and I'll call at what I gave about it. The sun he told me, and this house. They had no name for these pale-skinned strangers with their floating wooden mountain, but the ancestors had spoken in dreams of such men, men who would arrive speaking like spirits and naming things not theirs. Cook, flanked by Banks and the steadfast Marines, attempted a greeting. He raised his hands, palms open, a universal gesture, or so he believed, but universality dies quickly in the soil of the unshared. The warriors studied him, their ochre-painted foreheads refusing to bow to this man who stepped ashore as though he had the right. Tupaia, thinner now and bearing the weight of his own crescents of mystery, stepped forward. The Tahitian priest had grown quieter of late, his eyes cast not to stars but to the earth, listening. He spoke a few hesitant words, a mixture of Polynesian dialects meant to bridge millennia of separation between oceanic cousins. For a moment the warriors faltered, recognizing a cadence, a story half remembered from the veins of their dreaming tracks. There was no blood drawn that first day, only stares, long loaded looks that weighed down even the snapping Union Jack. Cook noted every movement, the silence, the absence of welcome or warning, the absence of fear that frightened him the most. In the days that followed, the botanists moved through mangroves and brush, collecting specimens unlike anything in European texts. Banks chattered ecstatically over a vivid flower whose petals spiraled like flame. Young assistants chased darting, limbless lizards through copper sands, cataloguing wonders for the shelves of London. Sometimes they were watched. Always, it seemed, they were watched. Each evening the smoke from the Endeavour's cooking fires rose beside that of unseen campfires nested deep inland, and sometimes beneath the anchor of stars drums echoed again. The crew joked at first, ghostly orchestras of some unseen tribe. But Tupaia laid his hand on the deck one night and whispered, "Not drums, hearts." The forested hills swallowed sound as they approached. Cook, determined to carry back not just flora but claim, led excursions further inland, seeking a vantage point, a claimable promontory from which he could sketch, record, possess. These were the days of empire, and hunger wore polished boots. But strange things marked their steps. On the third inland march a sailor named Fenwick vanished. One moment he was walking beside the others, whistling some Dorset folk tune. The next he was gone. No cry, no disturbed earth, only his tricorn hat dangling from a branch far higher than any man could reach. The crew muttered of spirits, of trees that moved, of watchers that struck silently from the dark. That night wild sounds encircled their camp, growls too guttural to be dingo, and shadows that moved too keenly to be wind. Cook's journal entry was terse, local fauna problematic, one man lost, shall redouble caution. But in the margins, in Cook's unmistakable hand, a stray line. Eyes, so many eyes. Banks, undeterred, continued his cataloguing. He found a grove of trees that bled red sap, and insisted on calling them Dragon Blood Woods, a name that made the crew shudder as they passed beneath them. Sydney Parkinson, already thin from illness, took to sketching compulsively. His inked pages showed not just the curling flora, but strange, angular figures half buried in the undergrowth. Hints of ancient totems, weathered stone faces swallowed by fern and moss. One evening he set his sketchbook in Cook's lap with trembling hands. "They know how to guard things here," he whispered, before falling into a fevered sleep from which he would not fully recover. But it was the cave that changed everything. They found it behind a veil of lichen and wind-scratched stone near the foothills, days inland, a low hollow that breathed cold despite the sun's heat. Inside were paintings, not crude but deliberate, spirals intersected with starbursts, figures with raised arms flanked by serpents that bent like coastlines. In the center was a ship, not of British or even Polynesian design, but long, impossibly long, with sails that curved like fish fins. Tupaia stared at it in reverent silence. "I have seen this in dreams," he said eventually. "This ship brought the storm to Vaituoro. It watched the sky fall in the east. None of it made sense, and yet none of it felt untrue. They left that place quietly, unnerved. All right, they moved by Guardian. By Ireland. Circumstance. That was even what kind of estimates we? Well, I saw a bit of what is even left? I'm not street. I think I'm just perfect. That's but it's fun for by the name of His Majesty King George III, I take possession of the whole eastern coast. By the name himself.
But even as he said the words aloud,
silent unbelievable. Rose from the trees, last head, turning noon into dust for a single breathless moment. To buy him, Sabes painful objects to buy out of the my personal fast can we don't get us. For no listen around. Was the she is half. They will remember this, he said, not specifying who. Later that day, a young midshipman strayed from his patrol near the bay's edge and did not return. When they found him, a spear had pinned his arm to the sand through his uniform. He was alive, barely, and gasping a single sentence again and again. "The man with the mirrored skin. The man with the mirrored skin." The captain gave no order for retaliation. Not because of mercy, Cook was a man of strategy, not sentiment, but because he now doubted whether any confrontation would yield meaning. What met them here was older than war, and more rooted than colony. It would not be answered by musket or treaty. Tupaia, too, began to change. His voice deepened, and in his dreams he whispered names from forgotten lineages. One night he stood at the bow and spoke aloud into the wind, not to the crew, but to the land itself, singing in an ancient tongue. When asked about it later, he claimed, "I was asking for forgiveness for what we have broken." The coral waters were quiet as they left. The sky was unnervingly still as Parkinson faded in his cot. His final gift was a sketch, a map, only half complete, its southern quadrant shrouded in curling ink whorls. In the center he'd drawn an island moving across the waves. No mainland near, just endless deep, a phantom. Cook stared at it long that night, tracing its edges. The likeness to the shapes in the cave was undeniable. Below the drawing in trembling script, "This place does not belong to us, and we do not belong to it." The Endeavour sailed on. Wounds salved, sailors scarred. The coast receded behind them, but no man on deck would forget the oppressive majesty of that place, the stillness that was not peace, the smiles that carried centuries of vigilance. Above, the stars continued their slow drift, but something in their arrangement felt wrong. Or perhaps. Chapter 6. Spirits of the Southern Ocean. The sea had shed its emerald warmth as the Endeavour slipped into colder, steel-colored waters, veiled in a draught of mist that seemed to rise from ancient dreams rather than the ocean itself. The stars above no longer danced with their familiar clarity. They trembled faintly, as if some imperceptible wind distorted the very heavens. Off the stern, phosphorescent waves trailed like serpents of dying light, and each day brought a growing sense that something, not merely geographical, was being left behind. It was as if the ship had crossed into a different realm of being, where charts lost relevance and myth began to write the rules. The Solomon Islands soon fell behind, their volcanic silhouettes swallowed by morning fog. Ahead lay the southern dominions, lands barely known to the imagination, marked in phantom ink on crumbling Dutch maps, and whispered of only in contradictory fragments. The crew grew quieter. Jests over salted pork and tar-black coffee lost their charm as deep dreams began to infect their sleep. Ropes knotted themselves incorrectly. The ship's bell chimed once without touch. An air of reverence, part dread, part awe, fell over the vessel, tangible as salt on skin. Cook's journal maintained its tone of discipline and precision. Wind measurements, currents, tides. But those who read over his shoulder, Banks chief among them, noticed new notations tucked beside the margins, small sketches of symbols not found in any European captain's log. A triskelion star enclosed in a spiral, a sea creature with no known taxonomy. Notes referencing Tupaia's dying words. Tupaia had passed weeks prior on the fetid shores of Batavia, his body racked by fever, though many later claimed he looked healthier than any man during his final breath. Even now the ship carried his influence like a buried ember. His star map, inked in a language even Parkinson had never matched, remained locked in Cook's chest, though its symbols haunted Banks's attempts at transcription every time he tried. Some claimed they rearranged themselves when overlooked. Banks, increasingly sleepless, had begun walking the decks at night. Once he claimed to see a distant light, like a bonfire dancing over the water several miles off the bow. No land was nearby, and none could confirm it. Parkinson scoffed, yet shortly thereafter was found absently drawing constellations in charcoal no one could name. He muttered of southern sails and stones that speak beneath the waves. Then came the first island that shouldn't have been there. It rose from the dawn haze, a strip of black sand and jagged volcanic teeth circled by gulls with red-tipped wings. The charts were clear. Nothing should have existed here. Cook hesitated, still driven by duty, or by the insistent pull of the ghost map. They anchored offshore and sent a party ashore beneath the cannon-studded shadow of the cliffs. The landing party returned, silent-eyed. They spoke of statues buried in the sand, weathered faces worn of all humanity, of spirals carved into flat rocks and patterns matching the star map. Wonder you that one. Yes, she name's Hell. We know herself. Yes, she named Tickon. They're most horrible. Remotion is immortal. I like it, I got hair. Oh, and the same again. You well, don't that it got on. I'm out there. What the enter? By Nia, you're born. Yeah, what is it? What is we say the thing? It's too hard. I learned that I'm out, and I'm saying that no. At one point, the stars seemed to rotate in a direction opposite their orbital paths, even as the compass spun just slightly. Not enough to scream foul to natural law, but enough for every sailor to feel it. Unease pulsed beneath the surface of perception, like some old truth being nudged awake. When they dropped anchor in Dusky Sound, a long-fingered inlet scooped into the flesh of New Zealand's southwestern arm. The heavens flickered as though the very air bent sideways. The bay was preternaturally still, the forest a procession of windless trees. When the boats were lowered, the men hesitated, staring into the stillest water they had ever seen. It was on one of the shadowed beaches within the inlet that they found the canoe. No ordinary dugout vessel, this. Its hull was ribbed with a technique none aboard had seen, more advanced than Tahitian rigs, more intricate than Maori war canoes. At least 100 feet from bow to stern, it had the grace of something half-avian, the fierceness of something forged for gods. The prow bore carvings in a language unknown even to Tupaia, symbols that slept between Polynesian curves and something more mathematical. Banks was entranced, Parkinson near tears. "New people have this," he whispered, sketching furiously. "On this earth." Inside the canoe were offerings, shells, stones polished to mirror sheen, and a constellation map painted inside the central mast column, painted in a mineral that responded visibly to moonlight. The stars changed shades as the night deepened. That night, the forest roared with ancient sounds. Not animals, not people, movements, rhythmic vibrations that shook loose bark from trees. Within their tents the men dreamed the same vision, a sea that opened into steps of air, islands floating upside down, and a being tall, faceless, clothed not in fabric but in constellation, standing in the surf, beckoning with arms like branches and sky. The Maori who met them the next day brought stone-faced silence. They avoided the forest, they warned against drinking from any untouched spring, and refused all trade save for smoked eels and carved talismans etched with trap knots, symbols to bind spirits. When asked about the canoe, the eldest among them, a wrinkled man whose words flowed like braided streams, spoke of an era before the canoe builders disappeared into the sea, chasing a star that flickered between the sky and the abyss. Cook, still clinging to rationality born of enlightenment and empire, recorded all. But his notes had begun to shift. He left pages unnumbered. Doodles lined the edge, spirals, waves, an eye that stared from the topmast into the ocean each night. 3 days later, a sailor was taken. Nothing was seen. No alarm rung. Just a scream, ripples in the water, and a trail of footprints that walked into the surf without turning back. Only one man saw it from the quarterdeck, Jones, a barrel-chested rigger, and said that a shadow beneath the surface moved against the tide. Whatever it was not a shark. Once Cook held them together, just barely. His belief in science, tethered to the stars, to sextants, to rational constructs, now battled with something elemental, something older. But he would not yield. "There is always an explanation," he told Banks, yet his hand trembled as he said it, watching the sea in case it answered. On the final day before sailing northward, a stone was found on the beach where the sailor had vanished. Flat, smooth, etched in the spiral sun symbol from the ghost map. Under moonlight, its surface glowed faintly blue. Cook took it. He placed it in the same chest where Tupaia's map lay. He did not tell the men. But Banks recorded, in tiny, cramped letters, a single phrase, "Something beneath us waits to be remembered." As the Endeavour lifted its anchor and curved its way toward the Torres Strait, the crew did not cheer. No wind blew at their sails, only a strange breath, silent and steady, like lungs in the deep, exhaling the ruin of forgotten stories. And somewhere, in that Chapter 7, The Ghost Map. In the oppressive heat of Batavia, where the air hung thick with incense and illness, the Endeavour drifted at anchor like a ghost too weary to haunt. Its timbers, barnacle-bitten from months of brine and salt, groaned in the stillness of the East Indies harbor. Around her, a city pulsed. Pale spires and Dutch-styled terraces pressed against native campong villages, the streets shifting tapestries of spice merchants, sultans, and soldiers. The scent of cloves lingered with something darker, rot, fever, death in slow curls rising from canals stagnant with rain. Inside the ship's shadowed sick bay, Tupaia lay coiled beneath linen, gaunt and glazed with sweat. His breath came shallow. For days now, the Tahitian had spoken in riddles, phrases tangled in ancient dialects no one aboard could decipher. Not even Banks, whose notebooks overflowed with transcriptions and phonetic attempts, made sense of this speech. It was not just illness overtaking the Polynesian priest-navigator, it was something older threading through him, as though, in dying, he became a vessel for voices that answered to no hemisphere. He clutched something even in restless sleep, a fragment of bark, wrinkled and dry, upon which alien constellations and swirling lines were etched in deep brown ink. This map, if it was indeed a map at all, had arrived in Tupaia's possession some weeks before his decline, passed silently to him by an elder on the eastern shores of New Zealand. None had seen the transaction, save perhaps Cook himself, who said nothing and recorded less. When first discovered among Tupaia's belongings, the bark was dismissed as a native charm, but in recent weeks it had become an obsession. Banks had taken it first, briefly, tracing the delicate lines with a trembling finger. "This is no mere ornament," he had whispered in Cook's cabin, lit by a single candle whose flame refused to sway though the ship rocked gently on still water. "These are not constellations from our sky, but they relate, distorted reflections, incomplete or too complete. It contradicts known charts, and yet positions stars in arrangement only calculable on nights we've yet to see." Cook had stared at it for hours. As a navigator and man of mathematics, he should have rejected it entirely. Yet the layout haunted him, mirroring eddies and currents his ship had drifted through weeks before or perhaps yet to come. The shape of one curve in particular, a spiral stretching across the parchment, intersected by dots like compass roses, resembled the route they might have taken had the great southern continent existed just beyond the horizon. And there it was again, looping back, a series of latitude marks converging near the edge of known mapping, just below the line of fire and ice. A phantom island, a point of nothing, or everything. It was Banks who named it, the ghost map. Inside the humid cargo hold, turned makeshift study, Banks surrounded himself with charts and botanical sketches obscured by translucent sheets. He stared at celestial charts and overlaid them with the outlines from the bark scroll. Parkinson's earlier drawings, jotted quickly before his own decline, contained flourishes and glyphs copied from the edges of the bark, detailing creatures unfathomable, fish with transparent eyes, birds with serpent tails, and towers of coral rising from the sea like cathedrals. Parkinson had claimed to dream of them. Dreams that turned feverish. He awoke one night, painting his blanket in soot, scrawling the same lines from the bark using the tail end of a candle's wick, sweat streaking his face. "The maps are breathing," he said, before his voice fled entirely. "Not drawn, not fixed, breathing." 2 days later, blood trickled from his ears and he stopped drawing altogether. Cook now stood alone with the map in his hands. It was changing. At first it seemed the ink was simply distorted by palm oils and age, but under moonlight the lines shimmered faintly as though reshaping themselves. A shifting current here, a star repositioned there. A central coil grew more pronounced, fed by thin tributaries that veered into nothingness, until they didn't. He documented the changes obsessively, searching for a pattern, and found one. Every minor deviation correlated with sporadic astronomical anomalies observed during the voyage. Stars that appeared too bright or vanished entirely, shifting magnetic deviations that bent the ship's compasses, and a strange fissure in the sky noted by crew when leaving New Zealand, like a hair-thin wound sliced into the firmament. Even the transit of Venus, recorded in Tahiti with precision, now seemed altered by forces unnamed. Cook had wrestled with stars since his youth. But this was not astronomy, it was memory. The sea remembering its own shape. Batavia offered no balm for these revelations. It was a city heavy with empire, where spices were weighed more dearly than lives, and the dead disappeared quickly from hospital beds, while administrators compared notes on tea yields. Of the crew, dozens had fallen sick. A surgeon swore he saw a man breathe his last with the phrase on his lips in Polynesian, though he had never spoken a word of it before. Tupaia died with his fingers wrapped around the ghost map, murmuring, "Moana o matua ke taha o nakwetu." "Ocean of ancestors," subsided the stars, before slipping into silence. Cook ordered the bark taken. He kept it pressed flat between aged parchment behind lock and key. He said nothing of it in his log, but Banks began a private ledger. He sketched the new patterns, compared them to legends from Maori and Tahitian traditions, and found a correlation. A drifting realm, described differently across languages but sharing roots. An island that moved, not across water, but time. An island accessible only when stars open to Aramatua. A parent path, a route reserved for divine return. Parkinson, in his final pages, hinted at this same conclusion. One entry, dated weeks before his death, read, "I believe we have not discovered an island, but a door." Cook, sleep-starved and freighted with memory, began to dream. Dreams of shadowy spires rising from beneath green water. A language sung across waves, Tupaia's voice joining with winds that whispered in spirals. Dreams in which his ship, pursued by no wind, sailed toward the sky. One night, delirious with fever from a heat wave that scorched the harbor, Cook woke to find water swirling and his basin forms forming against all physics. When he blinked, the water stilled. From then on, he wrote less, or at least less public thought. Privately, his journal transformed. The map is real, not a record, a reply. His entries began shifting perspective, no longer observer but participant. The passive language of the scientist gave way to urgency, words like resonance, recurrence, awakening. By the time they left Batavia, with 3 graves and another 6 fevered in linen below deck, Cook had memorized the map's coordinates, and not only by sight, he had seen them in his dreams. What those coordinates pointed to remained conjecture. A reef-covered archipelago, an island erased by time, a gate submerged beneath leagues of oceanic pressure, but the pattern that revealed the island also revealed another truth. The phenomenon matched a cycle, recurring once every 700 lunar returns. They were within that window. Banks approached Cook with a theory. The bark map was no primitive scrawl, but a transdimensional chart, its ink responsive to time and perception. That it had been waiting, for a voyage precisely like theirs. Perhaps it was not merely a map of what was, but what must be discovered, or the sea would reclaim its stories whole. Cook said nothing. Oh, but his eyes betrayed a certainty no longer rooted in doubt. The burden of command now gained metaphysical weight. He could feel it, a tide swelling inside him, a knowledge that something vast lay beyond the edge of the earthly sphere. Not for England, not even for science, but for the oldest part of men that had ever looked upon water and wondered what it concealed. Back in his cabin, he unrolled the map again, and for the first time it revealed a name, not in words, in arrangement, stars positioned not in sky order, but phonemes, a name spanning galaxies drawn by hand. He reached for his quill, but what he wrote was not a log. It was a vow, and though history would remember maps as static, Cook now knew the truth. Chapter 8. Return of the Unknown. The wind had a different texture in England now, or perhaps it was Cook who had changed. As HMS Endeavour slipped into the familiar grey swell of the Thames, flags waving and horns sounding like a chorus of distant sirens, the crowds that surged along the harbour's edge bloomed with expectations. Children perched on their fathers' shoulders, merchants shouted and tossed paddles, and sailors disembarked with exhausted smiles and pockets full of coral charms and whispering memories. But Captain James Cook remained still on the quarter-deck, his polished boots quiet against the worn planks, eyes drawn not to the mainland but west, to the horizon from which they had emerged. He wore the perfect decorum of the admired and twice-decorated naval officer, the ironed blue coat with its brass buttons, the white wig powdered just so. But those who stepped close enough noticed a certain strange wear to him, a dimming around the pupils of his eyes, like he'd seen too much fire through telescopes, or reflected something from the sea that refused to leave him. He came ashore in silence, flanked by Joseph Banks and a diminished, weary crew. There were no cheers from the sailors, only polite bows. Parkinson's sketches were exhibited in a gallery at the Royal Society. Banks gave daily lectures about floral anomalies and great flights of strange parrots. Reports were written, charts were etched. Cook submitted his logs, each page the image of rational detail, latitude, longitude, lists of trade items, approximate distances and routes. But those who studied them carefully began to note something odd, a difference in tone, an inflection in the language. Long, increasingly philosophical entries, observations regarding uneven harmonics in lunar tides, and micro-distortions in compass readings beneath Orion. Few knew what to make of these notes. Fewer still dared ask. The Enlightenment was marching forward, and Cook was its golden emissary. Except Cook, who now lived in a shadowed intersection between what had been written and what had simply been felt. At his residence in London he kept to himself. His wife Elizabeth, stoic and sharp as ever, noticed his night wanderings, the whispers while dreaming. He had grown thin, not from sea hunger, but from something akin to pull. On his desk lay a folded, brittle slab of ocean bark, Tupaia's star map. No one else had seemed to note its significance. Banks thought it merely a fragment of primitive, if exquisite, chart-making, a native's sentimentality. But Cook had seen it glow beneath starlight, had felt its pulse in his hands during certain phases of the moon. Constellations on the map changed subtly from week to week. There were glyphs he hadn't noticed at sea, one now forming a spiral like a cyclone's eye, inscribed with something resembling ancient Polynesian kanji melded to Phoenician trade script. No native tongue he had known, and certainly weren't any Banks could identify. He kept the artifact locked in a wooden drawer reinforced with copper nails. But some nights it unlocked itself, or so it felt when Cook arrived at his desk at dawn to find it unfolded, humming faintly, the ink rising like breathe on a mirror. One night, As November rain clattered softly on the window panes and London fog trickled like spirits through the alleyways, Banks knocked at his door. His eyes were wild and red-veined. In one hand he clutched Parkinson's final journal. He knew, Banks said, voice hushed beneath candlelight. He tossed the journal on the desk with trembling fingers and flipped open a page. It showed a frantic sketch, crude lines forming an island that did not exist on any known chart. "What is it?" Cook asked, though he knew. "It's the same island, James. I compared it. It appears on Tupaia's map here." He opened the bark scroll. The same island, slightly curved towards the bottom right of the star map, but on Parkinson's sketch it was recorded with cinders. He had drawn it as seen in a dream, he said, never approached by ship, but by stars. Banks leaned close. "It's real, and it's mobile." Cook closed the map. "Shifting land masses are the stuff of legend," Banks grunted. "So were kangaroos, once." "But here's the truth, James," Parkinson told me before he died. He believed that the island only becomes accessible under specific celestial conditions, every 91 years, maybe less, an alignment of the Southern Cross, Sirius and Rahui. "Rahui?" Cook asked. Banks paled. "It's not on our star charts, or is on theirs." Cook ran his fingers across the edge of the bark. "So, this was never just a voyage of discovery." "No," whispered Banks. "It was an awakening." In the weeks that followed, hushed meetings took place between Cook, Banks, and a select inner circle at the Admiralty. Gone were the public reports, the dry pronouncements. They gathered in the library stacks under low lamplight, whispering over planetary tables and Polynesian myth cycles. There were letters between Banks and members of the Royal Society that did not appear in archives. Lost, burned, or never written, but remembered between minds, fever-lit, with the same dream. One document, a torn page from Parkinson's journal not found with the rest, had surfaced. Smuggled to Cook by a grieving apprentice. The page was stained with sea salt and covered in inverted writing, only legible by firelight. It contained a poem, long, rhythmic, filled with references to a mirror beneath the ocean, a crownless empire of waves, and a gate east of the Hawaiian archipelago, where islands wander and names turn to stars. It was this final revelation that triggered the Admiralty's secret conscription of a second vessel. Publicly, Cook was to lead an expedition to search for the Northwest Passage. But secretly, its purpose was something far older, to seek the gate. The gate! Even saying the word aloud left a trace of cold at the base of Cook's spines. See, in early spring, Cook took leave to Spitalfields and visited a dying merchant's wife, an old Tahitian midwife brought to England years before. She had grown pale in the English sunless years, but her voice held the same cadence as the chants Tupaia had sung on moonless nights. "You carry his burden," she said, eyes rendered milk-white with cataracts reaching for his hand. Tupaia saw what lay under the waves, told the stars, told the sea, not all should wake. Cook withdrew gently, bowing low, but her words echoed like whale song in his blood. Back in his study, the ghost map unfolded itself one final time. This time the spirals converged, the symbols aligned. The island that had drifted across corner after corner of the map, gleaming faint as a crescent moon, sank slowly into the center and remained. As dawn came, Cook saw something on the map. New lines, etched subtly in the grain, a cartographic thread sailing from Tahiti to that ephemeral island, the trail ending abruptly in a curl of ink he'd never seen before. A symbol? A time marker? He inked a final note in his journal. Not a log, there were no coordinates, no tides, just a single line, a map not of geography, but gravity. And below it, a date, February 14th, circled lightly, a year not marked. From the windows of his home the Pacific wind blew in ghost-like tendrils carrying the scent of salt, fire, and some ancient rhythmic chant. He would go again, because the ocean was calling. And this time, it was not the charted Pacific he'd be sailing. It was the one beneath, the Pacific of memory, of gods, of islands that glided like fish beneath stars older than teeth and bone. And when he went, he would take the map, and perhaps he would return, Chapter 9, to the edge of the world. The sky above was a lid of fire and pearl when the Resolution approached the verdant specks of Hawaii. Strange weather had followed the ship for days. A glassy calm in the morning, then winds that gusted from impossible directions, stars blotching out and reappearing like embers in syrupy ink. Cook stood at the prow, with his eyes narrowed against the sunlight, clutching the worn edges of the bark-stripped ghost map. Its symbols, indecipherable to most, were shifting again, subtly reconfiguring themselves into new constellations. He traced them as one might a lover's face, half in reverence, half in dread. Tupaia's voice seemed to linger in the air, though the man had long turned to ash in distant oceans. Sometimes, when the wind funneled just right through the sails, it sounded like his soft instruction, chanting ancient directions that made no sense until the stars above inched to match the angles he once described. Cook had begun taking notes by starlight, comparisons between the ghost map and celestial movement. Whatever lay ahead was no myth. It was waiting. The moment they sighted land, the islanders gathered with wide eyes and chants, not with suspicion, no, but with the air of recognition. They greeted Cook not as a stranger, but as a long-promised figure of their own cosmology. Lono, Lono, they whispered and sang. The white sails fluttered in late sun like ceremonial robes. One elder woman knelt and kissed the lower step of the gangway. Cook, unsettled, stared down at her. If he knew what they believed he was, he also knew he was not. Rituals followed. Garlands wound around his shoulders, offerings presented with trembling hands. 100 fires lit the curved black beach as if stars had fallen to earth. Yet beneath the drumming and the feasting there was apprehension, a tightening of eyes among Hawaii's priesthood, a warning hidden beneath the honor. That night, as the others slept, Banks muttering in dreams of wind tunnels and spiraling jellyfish, the crew, restless from fermented kava, Cook returned below deck with the ghost map spread upon the navigation table. The ink shifted imperceptibly, geometries not merely of space, but time. Longitude twisted, latitude bled. He touched a swirling part of the parchment shaped like a whirlpool surrounded by 6 stars, each marked by a glyph of no known language. His fingers trembled. He opened a logbook with ritual regularity, but now each entry began with coordinates that did not correspond to earthbound measures. Each ended with the same closing line, "The gate draws near," not a gateway of planks and hinges, but of current, of dream. The waters beneath would come alive. He felt it in the marrow of the ship, in the sloshing beneath his bed at night. Hawaii's chief priest, Kohau, requested a private meeting after dawn. He was gaunt but commanding, his eyes pale like coral and shot with reddish rings. Beneath his feathered cloak he held an obsidian blade, ceremonial and curved. "You carry the same star bark Tupaia carried," he said through a translator. "It changes, dies, and returns. We have known this. You knew Tupaia?" Cook's voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't used it for days. Kahau only smiled, or at least offered a mouth curved like one. More than knew. He came as one who listens, but he did not accept. He refused the gate. "You approach it still. I seek nothing but truth," Cook began, but Kahau was already moving. "You seek the map below the mirrors," he said before leaving. The phrase struck him like thunder behind his eyes. The next day the map changed again. It no longer aligned with any star chart known to Banks or even the fretful midshipman who assisted him. It no longer described this world. Cook retreated into full silence. With every breath the ocean seemed to press against him, as if inhaling him inch by inch. The men grew fearful. Some muttered about veils between worlds, about the whispering in the hull. Then the storm came. It erupted without warning. One moment a cloudless sky, and the next a vortex of thunder, red lightning clawing the sea into angry spirals. The wind howled, not in gusts, but like a sentient moan. The Resolution should have sunk, but it did not. It was drawn forward, sliding along the map's unseen lines. Cook stood drenched on the deck as the storm parted. Dead calm, no horizon. Pale water blackened into clarity, showing things beneath massive geometric shadows, turning slowly, aware. The next day, land appeared. It was not on any chart, a shard of land rising steeply from the ocean like the back of something scaled and ancient. Its cliffs glowed faintly in certain light, like damp coal before ignition. The men begged not to anchor, but Cook was already rowing ashore with 4 chosen sailors, 1 midshipman with the map carried in oilskin. The beach whispered under their feet, not with tide, but with breath. On the interior cliffs were carvings, sigils from Polynesia, from the Marquesas, from Aotearoa, but older, twisting into one another until their origins were meaningless. Banks had seen something like them before, not in nature, but in fever dreams after Tahiti, when the transit of Venus had bled across his vision. The sailors did not step beyond the tide line. Cook did. In the cave he found it. The gate was not a doorway, but an absence. The walls pulsed with a rhythm not unlike a heartbeat, and at the deepest point a pool of water curved like the lens of an enormous eye. The surface shimmered with the inversion of sky, stars unfamiliar, galaxies bent in spirals of impossible symmetry. He stepped forward. His logbook, days later, would note, "Entry beyond terrestrial measure achieved. Stars reconfigure. The sea accepts." Calm memory returns, but on the same day, back on the beach, the men saw movement from the trees. Hawaiians, not with spears this time, but funeral garb, and among them a woman with lips stained with ink, singing a low mourning song. Cook returned later that night, or someone who bore his shape. His skin was warm, despite the cold. He spoke few words, took up the map, burned it, then said only, "We sail now." 2 days later the incident happened. Accounts vary. Some say a dispute over stolen goods escalated. Others whisper that the Polynesian elders realized something else had emerged from the inland cave, wearing Cook's bones like garments. A skirmish collapsed into a chaotic melee. Cook fell, or was pulled under tidal rocks on shore, or walked willingly into the water and dissolved, or something else. Weeks later, aboard the Resolution, Banks found the logbook again, damp, open to a page that should not have existed. The date marked 14 days after Cook's death. Its final lines: "We go where the stars do not yet know themselves. We sail now into the true Pacific, the one beneath the mirrors. Chartless, remembered only in salt and dream." Banks kept this secret for years, though at night he would wake to salt water on the floorboards.